Hello, we're back. Um, and in this lecture, I've been kind of throwing around maybe these terms of capitalism. And I think it's important that maybe I kind of explain a little bit about this idea of capital and labor in a capitalist economy, right? So capitalism is a economic form of arrangement, right? There's different types, but in capitalism, you have capital and you have labor. And maybe most of you have heard of this, who knows? But let's just break it down. Capital in a capitalist society, capital is factories, it's real estate, it's things that have value and wealth. So it's money, right? In a wider sense, it's the people that have the money, the owners of the factory, the people that own the real estate. They are the capital or the capitalists, right? In our case, we call them the 1%, right? They own more, which means that everybody else is labor, and labor is the workforce. Because if you don't own the factory, if you don't own the land, what do you own? You own yourself and your labor. So, if you go to work for Amazon, right? Jeff Bezos, he owns Amazon. He owns the factories, he owns the trucks, the airplanes, the all the shipping. He's the capital, right? And he's the 1%. If you go and work in, the Amazon dock and you load the truck, you are selling your labor, right? So you are the working class, okay? Or in other words, you are the 99%. And so in a capitalist society, as viewed by many, you have capital and labor. And there's been this kind of relationship between that has changed over time. Because in a capitalist society, each one wants to kind of come up better, right? Capital wants to exploit more from labor, and labor wants capital to give more back. Now, over time, this has gone back and forth. Excuse me, my nose is itching like crazy. Mainly because of mobility, and that's changed. How can you move money and how can you move people? But what has happened in the last roughly 40 or 50 years is capital, money, the wealth, has become much more mobile. And so we see things like factories moving overseas. Capital moves to where it is best used, and labor doesn't quite have that. And so one aspect that we've seen in the United States is a decline in labor unions. And why is that an issue? Well, one of the ways that labor can kind of basically bargain with capital on an even basis. Because think about it now, if you work for Amazon and Jeff Bezos is worth $1 billion and you're not happy with working practices there, what can you really do? Well, you could complain or you could quit. But if everybody who worked for Amazon worked together and said that if we don't change these working conditions, then we're going to go on strike, you'd have more leverage. And so labor unions are this kind of counterweight. It's the counterweight of labor to capital. And in the 1970s, almost 25% of all American workers were in a union of some sort, and that was the highest it's ever been. Interestingly enough, if you look at the income disparity, the gap between the richest and the poorest, it was lowest in the 1970s, and that number has been steadily declining ever since. And so that's kind of emblematic that capital kind of has the upper hand. So up until about the 1970s, right, the way things were made was this Fordist model. Big, huge factories that made cars in Detroit on assembly lines with huge workforces that were unionized. It took a lot of money to build these plants, and so capital had a lot of money invested there, and you need a highly trained workforce. So labor was kind of locked in place, and so they kind of had to work together. But we start seeing changes with laws that allow people to move factories to other countries. We talked about the shift in industry and the shift in service in the 70s, and now capital can find different ways to go. And capital becomes more mobile. So they can move the factory out of Detroit and move the car making to Mexico, where labor is less organized and less of a threat, and so they can make more money, right? And that's because we've changed the laws. We've made it easier to make things in other countries, okay? In fact, the whole way that we make things in this world now and how we deliver things has changed. With free trade, we have what are called just-in-time or flexible production systems. And this allows capital to move wherever costs are lowest. A great example is Nike. So Nike, right, they make shoes, they make shirts and sweaters and athletic gear. Nike is in Oregon. That's their headquarters. But they actually don't own a single factory. What they do is every year they decide what they're going to sell. They have their designs and they go around the world to various factories in countries like Bangladesh or Vietnam or India or China, and they say, this is what we want you to make, and this is how many we want you to make. They give the factories all the specifications, what kind of material, and the factories come back and say, we can make these shoes for you at $2 a shoe or $1.25 a shoe. And Nike finds the best cost. And what happens is every year they can move because they don't own the factory. And so what happens is the factories that make the things for Nike make just what Nike orders for them. But in their own interest, they have to be flexible because when Nike's done, maybe they're going to make Adidas or maybe they're going to make Wrangler jeans. So they're very flexible with what they can make. Now the benefit of this is that it allows capital to find the cheapest labor, which they can say holds their cost down, but in reality, it gives them more profit. Right? And so that is why that's happening. Harvey is a geographer who looked at geography but also looked at it in a social way. And he looked at the relationship of capital as a social relationship of capital and labor. Okay? And he says that because of all the things, the way this is set up, and this is kind of an important thing, so bear with me, capitalism as an economic system is capable of enormous growth and innovation. China between 1980 and today has grown leaps and bounds, and more people have been lifted from poverty at a faster rate than ever before in human history. Capitalism is what allowed the United States in the 1930s and 40s to basically outproduce Nazi Germany and win World War II. So it is capable of amazing growth and innovation. But there's this inherent flaw in capitalism, and that is to go back to the product life cycle. Right? Capitalism at its heart is about acquiring capital. If you are a capitalist, you want to acquire capital. You want to make money. You want to sell shoes if you're Nike. You want to sell iPhones if you're Apple. But follow that logic. If you make enough shoes and sell them to enough people and acquire all their money, then at that point they're not going to buy any more shoes. So capitalism at its very heart has this flaw that the better you are at capitalism, eventually you cause it to crash. We call those recessions or depressions when the economy slows down, right? And what happens is, to kind of put that off, capital now has become global. So, say for instance in the United States, Apple sells an iPhone to everybody in the United States, and now they can't sell any more iPhones. So what do? Instead of going out of business and going bankrupt, now they start looking for other markets. So they go global. So they start selling in other countries. And they also now want to lower their cost to compete with Samsung, so they'll find other areas to build their phones. So in other words, capital and globalism have allowed capital to kind of put off that final crash. But that's what Harvey says, that at the end of the day, that is an inherent contradiction. The capital is amazingly full of growth, but inherently will always crash. So when you look at this social relationship, right, labor isn't just you're working, it's people, it's place, it's politics. Organized labor, organized workmen in this country revolutionized what it is we view to work. In the 1890s, they began striking and demonstrating and finally getting people to accept that maybe 8 hours of work for 5 days a week was enough. The weekend was invented by organized labor. Back in the 1800s, people worked 7 days a week, worked sun up to sundown, right? And this has been weakened, though, by shifts, the movement of factories to other countries that don't have as strong a labor force, and by mechanization, right? Factories that are being run by machines. Cars are now made almost entirely by robots, and they make better cars. They also never call in sick and never want to raise. So that puts labor in a weaker spot. And we talked about how capital can move. This interesting concept right here, the Walmart paradox. So Walmart as a company, right, they want to pay their workers as little as possible, right? They grow by exploiting labor, right? They take your work, give you as little back, and they get the profits back. But here's the thing. To create a workforce that way, one of the ways that Walmart works is by selling things. And if the people in a town are working for places like Walmart and getting paid very little, in other words, if capital is exploiting labor that much, They don't have that much money to go buy things. And that's another inherent contradiction of capital too. If you exploit your workers too much, then they don't have enough money to be purchasers of your products. So in other words, laborers are consumers. And labor, when we look at it socially, we call this the class that you're in. What working are you? Working class? Are you upper class, lower class, poor? Right? All of us know that the work that we do and the money that we do are not just economic factors, but social factors. You know, there are actually garbage men out there who've been doing their job for 30 or 40 years, and through their union contracts are making very good money, right? But yet the social class of, say, being a garbage man or a sanitation worker still has that kind of stigma of being a poor job, right? So there are social aspects of what we do. A lot of what we do with money, right, is tied to that. We also usually see, and especially in other countries, there's a lot of ethnic relationships with this. So in our country, it's hard sometimes to distinguish between ethnic racism or economic racism. In other words, if you're poor in this country, you tend to be black. Conversely, if you're black in this country, you tend to be poorer. And they're kind of intertwined, right? We see this. Minorities usually don't do as well economically as the white majority in this country. So there's this very strong intertwining. Okay. And then the last thing is labor and your income, right? This affects your day-to-day household. So how you interact with other people. If you are somebody who is homeless or is living from day to day because of your economic situation, your social interactions are much more different than somebody who is a much more affluent lifestyle, right? Somebody who can afford to do things. I always think about this. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out in the future. But with this pandemic, and I've mentioned this before in a couple of discussions, how you experience this pandemic, I think in large part was dependent not so much on your health, but on your social place in the workforce, right? For those essential workers who had to go work at the grocery stores for probably minimum wage and maybe got an extra $2 an hour for a little while, right? But yet faced this disease day after day after day, riding public transportation full of people who are sick day after day. It was a much different strategy of getting by than somebody who could stay home and not work for 6 months or work remotely. And that leads me to our last slide. We're going to stop right here so you can get up and have a glass of water, and we'll come back in just a moment.